Thank you very much for joining our conference. Short information for all participants. Szanowni Państwo, jeżeli chcecie usłyszeć tłumaczenie konferencji, na dole w tym pasku toolbar jest taki, w menu jest globus i tam można zmienić na inną wersję językową i tam będzie dostępne tłumaczenie na żywo robione. Także tam zapraszam wszystkich uczestników. Max, we are looking forward for your speech. But before I will pass you a microphone, I must say that your presence here is a sign for me that nothing is impossible. And the event, Maciej said to me, we should invite Max Schrems. I replied, sure, no kidding. and he did it. So I must say that we have Max here because of Maciek and his trust that he's able to meet him and to invite him and we have here. And if you have any question to Max, just write it in chat. So one opportunity to ask some questions to Max, and I will read it. So some of them I will read it at the end, and I will try and I will ask Max to answer them. And stage is yours, Max. So go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And not too much magic. It's after all just a call. I was basically asked to talk a little bit about privacy in general, and then in the end a bit about enforcement. So rather generic, but as mentioned before, if there's questions later, that would be great. Also on specific cases or specific issues, if you want to. I'm quickly just going to share my screen here. Hopefully you can see that. Let me know if not.
Yes, I can hear you and see.
Perfect. So I think generally what we're working on is right now kind of this transition from a tech-based, like into a tech-based society, where basically we now go into this information society. And I think what's crucially important for any privacy debate is that generally, I think everybody that works in that field as well are usually the people that love technology, that love the new opportunities that it builds. And I'm kind of a big fan of these things. And I think most people that work on that are usually the people that also kind of took apart their computers and, started programming lessons and so on. And I think what's important for us is to mention that innovation and technology and privacy are not necessarily counterparts. They're usually, if technology is done good and in the right way, then privacy is part of it or part of the development or how to build something. So I oftentimes joke, it's not like, food and food hygiene are opposite things. If you go to good restaurants, you expect both. And I think that's a bit where technology in the longer run will probably go to, and where we're working on that it does go into that direction. So I think one first message that I think is important is to go away from this kind of balancing in two things that fight each other, more into a how can we get these two things to work together idea. The topic generally about privacy, I think is oftentimes a bit complicated for people to get their head around the first time around, because it usually has very different dimensions, and it has very different dimensions culturally, over time, and therefore I would like to dive into that a bit for a second. I think in general, what you can see is that we kind of have two levels of when we talk about privacy, two different things that people actually talk about. Again, there's probably 1,000 different things people talk about, but on a very generic level. I think the first dimension is kind of this idea of feeling of surveillance. Typical example for that is the idea of a panopticon. So this is an old idea of a prison, where all the prison cells that you see on this picture, each prisoner has the feeling of surveillance, because in the center there's a tower and there may be a guard watching or not. And that exact feeling should kind of change their behavior, change how they act, and change that they kind of comply more. And I think a lot of the privacy debates that we have right now are oftentimes already around this feeling, and there's usually a big disconnect, because the person in the tower usually feels, I'm not looking at people anyway, so what's the problem? While the people in the cells feel under constant surveillance, and then there's a disconnect between the feelings of people or their feeling of surveillance. Where people agree more is when there is actually like a consequence, like a real, so to say, real life consequence. For example, when someone makes a credit application and doesn't get credit because of some algorithm, or we have this with predictive policing and so on, or these ideas. And for example, you have a combination thereof in video surveillance. So one of the first things I ever dealt with was like, thinking about video surveillance. This is a picture of me when I was like 18 or 19, when I made an access request for a video surveillance camera in a store in Vienna. And the interesting thing is that video surveillance should basically do these two things. It should prevent stealing by that feeling of surveillance, but theoretically you can also react once you have theft, that you can see who it was. Usually you're not going to figure that person out on this picture, other than if it's like an employee that you know. But there is this idea of these two things. All of that is closely connected to our definition of freedom and peace of mind, and that there is usually kind of secondary rights that get violated once these freedoms are not there. So I want to highlight that privacy is usually what I would call an umbrella right. So only with good privacy you can exercise other things in life and have that peace of mind to do that. Now, freedom is easily described with like a picture of everybody's happy and everybody's free, but obviously there are limitations to that. There's different dimensions that we can go through. The first thing we hear the most oftentimes, it's now getting less, but originally that was a big topic or a big talking point, is this idea that there is nothing to hide. Like people that have something to hide have something, have done something wrong, more or less. And I think that is, I think, debunked by now, but we can go through that a bit. One of the ideas that this comes very close to is just the idea that you, for example, have something that you want to say, but you may only say it in a certain setting. A typical thing is you may bitch about your, I don't know, coworker or about some friend or whatever, if that person is not around. So we usually need certain environment to freely say what we think. I'm probably not going to talk differently in this talk that's broadcasted than how I talk over lunch. And this different setting of where information flows changes our behavior. And I think everybody that ever had some time to vent off knows that that is done differently if it's in a private setting than publicly. That is a very logical way. That is something that everybody understands why it is that way. But there are other dimensions of privacy. A typical example is anything that's connected to sexuality, where it's not that logical. Theoretically, you could have sex out on the street. There's no logical reason not to do that. But as a society or a culture, or our inner hormones or whatever it is, tells us that that's a private act, and we probably not do that. So I think in privacy, we oftentimes deal with feelings of privacy that are not always 100% rational or mathematically explainable. The contrary is, for example, the privacy in the voting booth, because only if you really are alone, you actually vote what you want to vote for. Typical example in Austria is that people do not say that they vote for the right-wing party, for the right-wing extremist party. So in polls, they usually say, no, I vote for someone else. But once they're in the privacy of that voting booth, they do actually vote for what they really want. And you see how this curtain makes the difference there. Unless you're in the US and the curtains are not that high, and you've got situations like on this picture. A lot of that information issue is also a matter of power, because if we move into an information age, information becomes power. And even more than ever before. Like in a poker game, you know that if you know what the other person has on their hand, or how many cards are around and so on, you have an extreme edge over the other person. Same thing if you, I don't know, apply for a job and you know the other people really don't have another candidate and they really need to take you anyways, and they do have a big budget, then you have a totally different situation to negotiate than if they know you really desperately need that job. So just who has what information changes a lot of our society, a lot of how our economics work as well. And you get to different results because one person does have information or not. Another dimension of all of that is cultural. So we do see that different cultures see different things as being private or not. So for example, in the US, there was the first case that talked about privacy in telco connections. And there is a sentence out of that judgment where they said the wires are not part of the house or office any more than the highways along which they are stretched. So they said your house and office is private, but once cables leave your house, it's not private anymore. They changed that later, but you see how different we can look at the same issue over time and in different cultural settings. The tradition in Europe is usually very different on these topics. However, we do see that now, because with the globalized internet, these different cultures start to clash, that there is just a very different approach in the rather dominant Silicon Valley versus a lot of the other parts of the world on how the approach to privacy is. Another element on all of that is usually government surveillance. I'm just going to quickly touch on that. We usually have in different cultures different views towards, is government surveillance better or worse than private surveillance? In my personal view, it's not much of a difference. But what we do see is that we have more and more of a connection between that. So for example, if we had data retention, we see that the governments are more and more tapping into the private network. So they say it's wonderful that some Facebook or some Google has all the data. Why should we, as the NSA, still go into each phone ourselves if these companies are already in and we can just get that data? That was to a large extent what Snowden has unveiled as well, which I kind of called a bit the Chernobyl of privacy. That was probably finally the point where people understood that this is not just theoretical, but it actually happens. And where we understood that then the international wires are tapped and so on. Independent of these kind of privacy options, there's also always the question of misuse. And not every privacy violation may lead to a misuse. So the first dimension of privacy that I mentioned before is just the fact that you are under surveillance. So if you think about a dog, it's kind of the fact that the dog has a leash around his neck. Doesn't mean that the leash is actually pulled or the directions the dog wants to go are changed. But then that's already a limitation. Then you actually have to, so to say, pulling on the leash. To give you an example, in Austria, we had people that were very activistic that went into like animal protection, but they did what was within the boundaries of the law. However, our government then decided that they will be treated as a terrorist organization, which allowed them to suddenly track them and do crazy stuff for years. In the end, they were acquitted. There was nothing that could be found. But just the procedure took so long that all of them basically lost their jobs, went bankrupt, and so on, just because they had to be in the courtrooms for months and months. So that may be one of the, so to say, minor things. If you take the other extreme, you have situations like drone killings in other countries where data is used to kind of feed that into automated killings that happen as well. Not probably what's going to concern us every day, but just to get an idea of how far that can go. I try to speak a little bit slower, I'm told, and try to do that. The next thing is that we usually have very dominant companies in this privacy sphere. So it's not just that we have this kind of monopoly of the government, but we now have monopolies or duopolies on the internet as well. A typical example are the Googles, the Apples that are de facto, for example, the two organizations that actually decide what our smartphones do, because after all, we have a duopoly there. We did see, for example, how Facebook started as a social network and gradually now becomes a communication hub that just buys up each new app that could be a competition and thereby monopolizes this social media space more and more. And the reality is that these companies are then having an extreme edge that is oftentimes comparable to a government, but oftentimes go beyond the government. If you see that, for example, the EU now decided to have an embassy in the Silicon Valley, you see that they almost treat them now as sovereigns and not really as companies. And that is situations where billions of people are don't really have many ways out because they kind of have to be there because of networks effects of these issues. And there is, if anybody of you likes Little Britain, there is usually this situation where the computer says no. That computer in Little Britain is a credit ranking agency. But that may well be a software that says you cannot participate in social media anymore because you posted something that the algorithm doesn't like, or that was actually traumatic, and you move more and more of these decisions of how much you can engage in the digital sphere to individual private actors and not to like a government where you have appeal and a legal system that can go after that. What I touched upon before already is kind of this, what you now call public-private partnerships, so that government and private entities go together more and more. A very good example of that is the National Security Agency in the US, the cases that are now called Schrems 1 and Schrems 2, where basically the NSA said, you know, we don't have to hack everybody in the world anymore. We're just going to tap into the big companies and get the data from them. Which is very efficient for them and leads you to a situation where there's not really a large differentiation between state actors and private actors anymore, because they become more and more entangled and intertwined. A very analog example of that as well, or analog, but like a rather like old-fashioned example, was that banks, for example, also have to check like your transactions. So I actually had a friend and we were joking about, I gave him some money in the US because he ran out of money. His credit card didn't work anymore. So I think gave him like $150 or $200 or something like that. And because I gave it in cash and just in an envelope, I joked that like in the US, you know, if you do that, that's almost like drug money. And he later transferred the money back in my bank account and just used as a purpose drug money. Now that got me into serious trouble because some algorithm decided that I could have been engaged in drug dealing there. And that was situations where it turned out later that the bank actually has to do that because of some government regulation and then forward that information. So you see how these private actors and government actors kind of get entangled more. Another dimension I would like to throw at you is the development of what we now call big data, which is just the possibility that with that information that you have, you can find out much more patterns and much more intelligence than the data itself would reveal. To give you a simple example, these are ID numbers of my Facebook friends. And from these numbers, you cannot really say much. But I had a company that basically scraped the friends profiles of these people and was then able to kind of build this cluster. This is rather old, but at the time that was kind of my friends cluster. And from that, you could, for example, figure out that I was not going to the military in Austria, but I was working for the ambulance service for a year as an ambulance driver, because I had all this friends bubble there that were friends with each other, and all of them, or majority of them, said that they were working for the ambulance at that time. So even though I never put that into a system, you can calculate it from what other people have put in there. In a similar way, I was in Malaysia. I was working for AFS, an exchange organization, and you can see the bubbles there, a Austrian bubble, an international bubble, and a local bubble. You could also figure out my universities and schools. And what was the most interesting thing is you could figure out my sexual orientation, because one friend's bubble is basically all gay, and they put their friends in, or like their partners in. So from that, you could extrapolate my sexual orientation, even though I've never posted that or publicized that much. And you can see that from just this friends list of a couple of IDs, you can actually get all this additional information. And that is also used by companies to a certain extent. We had these cases where, for example, Target in the US could predict pregnancies based on what people are buying. It may be just a very good story, but you have a lot of these situations where you can figure out stuff like that. Sometimes even more than people know about themselves, because these patterns give you so much more intelligence than people themselves necessarily know. Getting back to this power dimension of privacy, the really interesting debate I think we're going to have over the next years is how this informational power is distributed. And to a certain extent, privacy and the GDPR is maybe one puzzle piece here. And we could probably look at this debate as what you could call informational redistribution. So just like we have economic redistribution through taxes, where richer people pay more, and we have subsidies for people that don't have that much financial stability. There is an idea that basically these privacy rights, for example, are part of that, where the weaker part is protected a little bit and has his privacy protected or her privacy protected, while the stronger part would then just not get that information, and thereby this informational distribution would be rectified a little bit or evened out or made more fair, however you want to see it. In the other direction, there may be similar rights. For example, right to access is the possibility that you get information down. So you basically get it from the big international company down to the individual user to figure out what data they actually process about you, what they know about you. So you have informational flows in the opposite direction. I think GDPR and privacy is a very first puzzle piece in a very big debate that we're going to have over the next probably 100 years. And we may see more trends in that direction also with the new acts in the European Union, where you try to limit the options of the very big guys and try to kind of add the right to privacy or other rights like that to the side of the consumer. If we now go a little bit in the end into the right to privacy, I think one fundamental reality is that this is going to be here. We have the right to privacy in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So in the European Union, we would have to agree that all member states would remove that article from the Charter. Basically, two articles, Article 7 and 8. The one is the right to privacy, the other one, the right to data protection. And the reality is this is going to be here and be here for good. So I think it's wise to accept that and to work with it in a positive way. And that is also the reality that we had. This charter was also the basis under which we then had to pass the GDPR as an implementation law in practice for this fundamental right. And I think that's kind of important to start out of. What we see, however, in reality now is that we have a huge lack of enforcement still. So we do have a lot of laws and a lot of regulations in Europe, and we're usually great at promoting them and feeling that we're the biggest fundamental rights protectors the world has ever seen. But the reality is that the enforcement is usually lacking behind a bit. I usually joke is like each speeding limit is usually enforced a bit more than your average privacy policy or your right to access. And that is a phenomenon that especially at NOIP we're working on to fix or to get moving. Doesn't mean that, you know, each tiny violation of some minor thing of the GDPR is a big issue, but you have very large companies that really make fortunes out of violating the law. Then you have to wonder if we're doing the right job. A lot of that is largely cultural and because of how the data protection authorities are equipped. This is an old picture. That's not the current one anymore. But this used to be, until a couple of years ago, the Irish Data Protection Regulator. And that's a little supermarket that you can see here far outside of Dublin. And the actual data protection office is actually this blue window here on the right, where you actually walk up and the offices were up there and the rest here is the supermarket. And that was the regulator that used to regulate, you know, Google, Facebook, I think Microsoft to a large extent, all the big guys. And that is a bit how a lot of this law is there on paper and not necessarily enforced yet. They now moved into the office and got much bigger and now have 140 people. However, a lot of these DPAs are still very analog. So cases are very slow. They still basically do everything paper-based and cannot even remotely follow the speed of developments that happen around them, even though they're meant to regulate the digital space. We also have issues that, for example, that's also from the Irish DPC, that they're simply just not even contacting or not even reacting to citizens that bring concerns, that bring up issues. That's a bit the status quo. It gets better gradually, but that is a bit how we experience the first years of the GDPR. What's coming up is probably just much more litigation. So we see a trend that there's frustration with the regulators. So there will be more civil litigation, more litigation in courts. There's a lot of opportunities for that in the GDPR, on top of the regulators themselves speeding up in specific countries. and moving from a purely informational, like trying to help companies to comply approach towards a more actual enforcement approach, just like if you speed, that you basically pay your speeding ticket then. Another thing that is upcoming in the next years is that there is going to be a collective redress directive coming up next summer. So there's going to be the option that that users group together and file lawsuits as, let's say, 1 million people, and that would hopefully scale up the financial dynamics here as well, because it would then allow you to actually bring cases without having to risk yourself to pay for all of that. We're also watching, especially the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice has about 20 or 30 cases, I guess, right now on the GDPR and interpretation. And we would expect a lot of the decisions there would clear up a lot of the issues. And so far, as I can tell from my own experience, we usually have very reasonable results out of the Court of Justice. Not too crazy, but also say, you know, guys, that's the law now, and we'll have to do that. So that is another space that we watch a lot. Finally, just to mention who we is. So I started an NGO. It's called NOIB. It's a European data protection organization. It's based in Vienna. We're also constantly looking for people to join us. And we're basically supported by a couple thousand people that donate to us and support that work, like a consumer rights organization. So I guess we're a bit unique in actually working on that side of the game, and therefore also have a bit of an experience of what works and what doesn't work. I hope that was useful for you guys. Thank you for listening in, and as far as I understand, we can now move to questions as well.
Yeah, I believe it was very, very useful. And thank you for that. Actually, I love a scary meme where there is a text saying that you don't need to send a CV when you apply for a job for Google. They know everything about you, and I love this meme, and it's so true, I believe. And I think this picture of Irish authority, the building of this Irish authority office, shows the power of difference between corporation like Facebook, like Google, and the bodies that oversees them. And it's really this picture appeals to me. No, it's like.
They now have a new office, so I can't use that picture that much anymore. But it's still also, I think, it also embodies a bit what's sometimes inside of these buildings.
Yeah, I know, but it's still the potential is the huge. There is a difference in potential with lawyers and with everybody, with everything. Okay, and we have one question from people, but I have a question to you from my side. Did you hear of similar initiative in Europe to seek the benefits of the GDPR implementation as a motivator?
So compared to us, there is Article 80 of the GDPR that allows an NGO to represent people. That's what we're using. We're not aware of other people doing that in a structured way. We usually work with the consumer rights organizations and the other digital rights organizations. There's an umbrella that's called EDRI for them. But most of the NGOs are more working in the advocacy, so awareness and putting out posters and whatever, and videos and so on. That's more the NGO sphere, and they have usually much broader. They do all digital rights, from copyright to freedom of speech to, it's a very big basket. We're the only ones that really only do privacy. And on the consumer rights organizations, they usually do all other consumer issues as well, from, I don't know, holidays that go wrong to that. So in a very specialized way, I think we're unique. But we usually then cooperate with everybody else around when they have projects that overlap.
Okay. Do you think it's possible to change the paradigm of GDPR implementation from a stick to a carrot?
I think we need both. The reality is that just the carrot alone is not doing it either. I think the narrative is important because we have to work with it. It's not like, once you work against something, it's usually much more uphill than if you try to work with it. It's like, sailing. If you try to sail against the wind, it's usually harder. If you zigzag, you can actually use the wind to go where you want to go. And I think that that mindset is also for us important. We don't see ourselves, for example, as an option to say what you can do, but to say that you have to do it differently or in a more privacy-friendly way. And I think that's a bit how, if you are a motor company and you just try to say climate change doesn't exist, that approach is in the long run not going to help you. If you try to say, okay, let's move to electric, let's move to something else, you're still selling your product, but you sell a better product, and we move forward. And I think that's in the privacy world, a paradigm that we could use a bit more sometimes. And also to think about, for example, user experience. If really users don't want to get bombarded by something, then you may make them a happier customer to come back if you actually allow them that choice in a reasonable way. However, if you have, I don't know, good deals or something where people can actually benefit from, then usually they would be happy to say yes as well. And that oftentimes needs probably more of an explanatory situation and more of a, you have different choices and we want to do the right thing for you approach than, for example, a cookie banner that just says, click here, otherwise you can't see our website, which is a very, confrontative way of doing things.
That's true. Okay, we have several questions from people, but few of them are around Privacy Shield and what's next. The question is, do you know some about next stage with the Privacy Shield, the new Privacy Shield, which will
Yeah, so unfortunately what we hear is not very promising. It seems that the US is even now backpedaling. There was about 6 months ago on Sunday, 6 months, this agreement in principle that there will be some new solution. And there were basically 3 or 4 headlines. And the problem is that we don't know the substance. And I think even the negotiators don't know the substance. It was a political agreement where Biden and von der Leyen were basically saying, now we just agree on anything. Apparently from the US, Ukraine was unfortunately used for that a lot, to say now we have, because the Russians are coming, we have to stick together and just do something, which I'm not sure how that connects to privacy, but apparently politically it does somehow. and it seems that what they do is to just pass Privacy Shield another time. So we saw that they passed Safe Harbor and it got rejected by the Court of Justice. Then he called it Privacy Shield. The text was largely the same. It got rejected by the Court of Justice. And now it seems that we're doing the same exercise another time. The one thing that they apparently tried to do is that they introduced in American law another executive order that will say that they will be reasonable or proportionate or whatever. They use some word that's unclear yet which word they use in their surveillance. However, they also say they don't change the surveillance practice. So we will just see a political word game where they just add 1 or 2 words in the US. The commission will then say, whoa, now everything is absolutely different. We have to pass the same thing another time. And then it will probably just go back to the Court of Justice. And I think gradually the court will also probably get more and more aggressive, because if you're the Supreme Court of the European Union and you tell the Commission you can't do it and they continuously repeat it over and over again, then as judges, you probably don't feel taken seriously anymore. And especially for the Commission, it's going to be interesting as well. I mean, take the example of Poland. If they say that appointment of judges there would violate Article 47, and therefore there is action by the Commission against a member state, it's very hard for them to at the same time argue, oh, in the US there's no court at all and it's wonderful. So I'm sometimes wondering how these things could possibly politically get together. And that's the reason why I'm unfortunately not thinking that the new solution will last very long. And we'll probably just gonna see a ping pong here for a while, which is unfortunate. My personal view is that if the US industry would say, that's a problem for our international customers, put its weight behind it in the US and say, we're going to lose international customers because of this drama, then maybe the US would change and would go to reasonable things that they provide for their own citizens as well, and that we provide in Europe, like, for example, that a judge has to approve surveillance, which is standard practice in all democratic countries. Just that the US has this idea of, if you're not a US citizen, then you simply don't have these fundamental rights. You're a second-class person. And that is fundamentally the problem. Once there is an acceptance that human rights is for humans, not just for citizens, we'll probably not have these issues. And that is, in the long run, I think what we need, because my personal vision is that we do have international data transfers as much as possible. and that we build a block of the democratic, civilized countries, so to say, that have standards, but that have standards not just for their own people, but for everybody else as well. And then we could have a free flow of data within that sphere. Very last sentence, because we are already a bit over time. We're probably going to have similar issues with a lot of other topics, not just privacy. Freedom of speech is another one. In Austria, it's prohibited to have Holocaust denial. In the US, that's considered freedom of speech. So if you have an international system, what's going to rule a platform? And I think we're going to have much more of these debates in the next 20 or 30 or 40 years to come to conclusions that then work for everybody, because we're not going to give up Holocaust denial as a crime, and the US is probably not going to give up freedom of speech. So there's more to come probably in that sphere.
Well, it's brilliant said that privacy concerns humanity, not the citizens. That's great conclusion from this conversation. Max, thank you very much for joining me. There are several questions to you. We have in our anketa and now and here, but we will try to answer the question for the people and then public them. Now we are going to split the conference to 2 rooms, and we are going forward. Thank you again for.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye. Have a good one.
Have a nice day. Thanks you.